Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, and then whoever else logs in can do that as they may. But we wanted to welcome everybody. I see a couple of familiar names in our attendee list, so this is kind of fun. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jessica Boscarino, and I'm an associate professor of political science at Marist. And I teach classes in environmental policy, which is how I connected with our featured speaker here today, Matt Harris. Matt just graduated from Marist and he undertook the Marist Earth Ally Project as part of his honors thesis. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Matt to introduce himself and to tell you guys a little bit about the project.
Perfect. Thanks, Dr. Boscarino. So I'm just going to share a little bit of a presentation. I'll go through it pretty fast, and if you guys have anything that you want to ask, any questions or comments, you can type them in the comment section, which is like a little comment bubble on your WebEx interface. Um, so what I'm going to do with this presentation is run through what the Marist Earth Ally Project is, just so everyone kind of has a footing on what's going on, and then go into a specific issue, environmental justice, that Dr. Boscarino I think is particularly relevant for discussions going on in America today about race, police, policies, and so forth. So we're going to get into that in a little bit. And again, if you guys have any comments or questions or want to add anything, we'd love to read them in the WebEx through the Q&A section, like the Q&A comment section that you can type into. So the Marist Earth Ally Project started with an idea by me and my dear friend Jess Howe, whom some of you may know, and it came from hearing kind of funny comments here and there from across campus, and these are some of the things that we were hearing. And the first four are, some of them are funny, some of them are not, and some of them are very 2017. And they all relate to these claims that people like use in environmental arguments all the time. And they always go back to this idea of like, but it is real, but it is true. And we wanted to give people a better footing for arguing for great, like a positive environmental policy and talking about environmental policy. And so our idea was a activism and awareness program to not only get these people who kind of have a footing in environmental sciences, like a little bit, get them into the introductory material and have them thinking about big environmental issues and environmental awareness. And the other group of people we were talking about and kind of focusing on with this is people who are like, oh, I don't do politics, I don't do environmental science, whatever. This is like a very easy first step in terms of activism and awareness. That's not very hard to do. That kind of gets you up to date on what's going on, and allows you to kind of argue better and think bigger, which was what Jess and I came up with a while ago. And the other group of people we were also addressing is people who are just like, oh, like I recycle, like I'm good with the environmental part. And so what this kind of project was all about was giving people suggestions for what they can do to be better Earth allies, better environmental activists on whatever level. So this project was really focusing on meeting people where they are. Like if they have a bunch of in-depth knowledge, they can really dig into the material, do tons of reading, or if they just want a really quick introduction just to figure out like kind of where they stand on issues, they can also do that through this program. So these are some of the other reasons why we decided to put this program in place. This was a Earth Ally or a seed club campaign we did my freshman year, and it was just kind of putting these facts out for people to think about their views on the environment. And it was pretty successful, and we got some good feedback. And that was one of the reasons why we created this program, is again so people can get more involved and have some idea of not only what they can do, but kind of figuring out what they can learn more about environmental issues today. So the concept came about for this Earth Ally program, which mirrors the Marist Ally program, which is a allyship program for LGBTQ folk. And so the mission of the program became to establish these small and attainable goals for people to focus on their activism, focus on their awareness, and kind of meet them at whatever level they're at, and to foster a real sense of caring towards the environment, and specifically for Marist. And so the idea came in two parts: online training and in-person action. And so the requirements, which this entire program is based on the honor system, there's no kind of like checks or grading or stuff like that. It's really just up to the person. It's like a set of ideas and concepts that you can focus on. The requirements are different for students, staff, and faculty. Again, this training was always meant to be open to everyone. The training, which is the core part of it, and then we came up with these two requirements that about turning lights off and using electronic devices less, because there's such easy tasks that you can do that constantly remind you, like every day you can do this, and that's constantly like you're thinking about what you can do that's better for the environment. I mean, these are very minor things, um, like very, very small goals, tasks that you can do. And so this was the idea behind, these are the requirements for becoming an Earth Ally, and these are kind of personal requirements, which are just like suggestions we had for things that people specifically in our community, our Marist community, could do. And the biggest component of this is the training. So what does this training look like? What does the Earth Ally Project actually look like? It's all on iLearn. It's all accessible to students, faculty, and staff. It's a series of lessons that we'll go over briefly in a second. Lessons or trainings that are presented by Marist faculty, staff, and students on various environmental topics. And then once you complete viewing those PowerPoints, you post in the forum section on iLearn just your thoughts, feelings, responses. It's a lot of feelings based, a lot of thoughts based engagement about environmental issues. And that's how you get credit for the trainings. And this is the way that the administrators of the Earth Ally program can give you credit for taking part in this allyship program. So just like the Marist Ally program, the Marist Earth Ally program has a certification process. You have a little sticker that you can stick on your laptop or door that you get once you complete the forum section. So that's the training and the program in a nutshell. It's this big idea of having people in the Marist community at whatever level that they're thinking about environmental issues become more engaged, more aware of the issues, have access to a lot of training material, participate in the online iLearn training if they want to, and kind of engage in the forum section with other people and think about where they stand on environmental issues. So that's the whole training in a nutshell, and anyone can find it. So if this is the classic home screen of your iLearn site, if you go to the left side and hit membership, once you click on the membership tab, you hit joinable sites, and you can hit the search bar, and you can search for Marist Earth Ally. I took this screenshot a long time ago before the Marist Earth Ally program was up. So it says there's no joinable sites, but it should be under there. So anyone in the Marist community can join this site, and you can do any one of the trainings. You can do none of the trainings, just look at the resources. Again, totally tailored and meeting the individual where they're at. This is the Earth Ally curriculum. This is what we have so far, and hopefully students down the line will add more units to the curriculum. As you can see, it's a huge, diverse grouping of topics presented by interested students, faculty, staff, and so on. And you can really choose whatever lessons you want to get the certification. The only requirement is doing the introduction, so you can receive more in-depth details about like what the program's about and other actions you can take. And so the one thing that I wanted to address before we go into a little bit of a sample lesson that if you post in the forum section will totally count towards your certification process is environmental stewardship. So this is like the idea that kind of undergirds the entire program. And it's this idea that, at least in my own words, is that if humans have the unique capacity to do an incredible amount of damage towards the environment, and so if we have that ability to do a lot of damage, we also have a role and a duty to be positive towards the environment and make positive changes. And so this is this idea of entrusted care. If we have the ability to do a lot of damage, we also have the responsibility to mitigate that damage or figure out a better way to do things. And so being a Marist Earth Ally has everything to do with being an environmental steward, having this idea that you are entrusted to be a steward of the environment on your community level, even on state and national levels when you're talking about and looking at environmental policy and voting, because when it comes to the environment, your vote does matter. And so this is the idea behind the whole construction of the Earth Ally program stems from environmental stewardship. So that's a quick, brief overview of what the Earth Ally program actually is. And kind of what we're talking about and the goals of the program. And so now we can move into a specific topic of environmental justice, which I feel is particularly relevant today when we're talking about um, large policy reforms that have to do with the police, criminal justice in this country. And I think they also have a lot to do with environmental policy. And we can definitely get into a little bit of bigger thought questions concerning this issue. But the interconnectedness of what's going on right now has everything to do with environmental justice. So this is one of our big sections for the Earth Ally program. And we'll start with just a really, and we only have there's only a few slides on this, and hopefully Dr. Boscarino and I can get into the questions. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of different types of identities, in regards to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And this is directly from the EPA, an executive order and pieces of legislation that this is designated as what environmental justice means. And so what I think is a good interpretation of the federal kind of idea of what environmental justice is comes from Columbia University, from the Earth Institute, and that's the right to live, work, and play in communities that are safe, healthy, and free of life-threatening conditions. And so this is a very, very encompassing definition, and there's a lot to do with it. And so basically we're talking about here equity of environment. And also, I just want to mention, this is the classic layout of a slide, any slide that you'll go into for the Earth Ally training. It'll have some text that's easy to read, sources in the lower right-hand corner, the date in the center bottom, about kind of where the information is from. And the right is going to be also like links. There's a PBS link towards the top right corner. And so this is just like a classic Earth Ally program slide. And there's even a voiceover that's kind of talking about the same things that I am. So this is the concept of environmental justice, and it's particularly applicable to things that are going on today. So the opposite of environmental justice is environmental injustice, and that comes from environmental discrimination and particularly environmental racism. So you can take a look at some of this was compiled by a magazine called The Nation, about how race is the most significant predictor of a person's living near contaminated air, water, and soil. And so environmental racism is that our very environments that we live in are structured in a way that is inherently racist and has racist components that come from legislation, actions, both of law and of policy and norm that impact people of color more than white people. And so what we're talking about here with environmental justice and environmental injustice is very simply that people's lives, the environment they live in, is unfairly distributed. It's unfair. And so this leads to a discrepancy in environmental hazards. And so environmental hazards are things that are in our everyday environments, from our, far down micro level, our homes. Maybe there's asbestos, lead in the water, to meso community levels, which is a better polluted river, to a macro level, which is something that could be used would be the border wall impacts a great amount of communities. So environmental hazards happen on various levels, and they stem from environmental injustices. So people living in dense urban environments in communities of poverty tend to have more environmental hazards than people living in wealthy communities or wealthy suburbs. And so when we're talking about environmental justice, we have to address that there's an imbalance of environmental hazards that are facing people. And something that I'm particularly passionate about is viewing violence as an environmental hazard. So you would almost no one brings together the idea of violence in communities and environmental studies and sciences. And so the way we plan our communities, environmental planning, the way we address environmental health impacts, and violence are all related. And so if you look at poverty level and level of residence, you see a negative grouping with higher instances of violence, and that's particularly higher in urban settings of violence. So viewing violence as more of not even of a policing issue or a criminal justice issue, but also viewing it as an environmental issue, as a public health issue, as a very deeply interdisciplinary issue, is another factor and piece of being a really positive Earth ally, is understanding that when we're talking about environmental issues, we're talking about a lot more than just save the bees or save the trees, stuff like that. We're talking about really in-depth issues that intersect with a lot of policies and practice that people are impassioned by and that matter. So a great example of the intersectional nature of like sociology, environmental studies, activism, current topics is the Flint water crisis. Just to go over it really fast, 2014, the government of Flint, which was under an agreement with the state of Michigan, switched their water source from Detroit to Flint, and there was a difference in pH. And what happened is the pipes corroded and lead leached into the community, and this caused really horrifying impacts that was a very widespread, and people learned about it through media reports, and it kind of has drifted to the periphery. It's still an ongoing issue in Michigan, but this is a very connected issue, and you can apply almost any field of study to looking at the Flint water crisis. And specifically, when we're talking about environmental justice, we want to look at the idea of who are the citizens of Flint. And when you look at the citizens of Flint demographically, it's a predominantly Black community, it's a predominantly poor community. And so this environmental issue, this government policy decision that was largely an environmental issue, turned into an environmental justice issue when the impacts of these people's environment turned bad, and it was because of government policy. So this idea of environmental justice, and specifically in the context of the Earth Ally program, is showing that there's a lot of awareness and a lot of activism that is still ongoing and has to be looked at through the lens of environmental justice. And the Earth Ally program is Marist community's link to this issue, finding out like what's going on, what's the latest, and what can you do about it in our kind of local community. Oh, sorry, that was part of the recording that used to be in the presentation. So that was a good sampling of how each of the Marist Earth Ally program slides will have a little voiceover, and that happened to be mine when I did the environmental justice PowerPoint. And so just to kind of cap this discussion off about environmental justice and thinking about this very large issue, is I want to draw your attention to the middle of this quotation, with oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions. And really what this is drawing focus to is oppressive toxins is things in our environment, lead, mercury, pollution, that really negatively impact people's quality of life, and toxic oppressions, which is things like institutional racism, or like a specific environmental example would be placing polluting factories, areas of pollution within communities of color, would be this idea of institutional racism, that our very institutions, our policy, government, and government practice has a unfair bias towards people of color. And so it's the two ideas of placing people of color in harm's way of toxins, and also these oppressive institutions that enforce environmental racism today. And so that's just like a little sampling of something that we would talk about in the Marist Earth Ally program. And that section's all online through the iLearn platform. And I have very quickly just some thought questions that Dr. Boscarino and I are going to talk a little bit about this environmental discussion that we just had. That was a very quick introduction to environmental justice. And I would really like everyone to think about these questions. And the first is, are recent events and increased activism concerning police an isolated movement? And from what we've been kind of looking at in this environmental justice idea is no, that people's environments, people's health, housing, education are all related to the way we police our communities. And so there is an intersection between these two seemingly completely unrelated issues, environmental studies and policing. And so the answer to this is like, yes, like recent events have so much to do with different types of policy and practice. And it's totally not an isolated movement. And things that we think of as isolated, like environmental sciences, kind of viewed in a bubble, are not. They're related to all these other issues that we're talking about. Dr. Boscarino, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in here because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is might seem mundane because it's about terminology, but your choice of the word ally. Because as you mentioned, the root of it for your project here at Marist, we have an ally program that's been in existence for a while with the LGBTQ community. And so, and we could think about, the current Black Lives Matter and the calls for, white allies, right? So, like, what about, what is it about that term that you feel like that drew you to use it for your project and sort of, who are we being the allies of here, right? Is it the actual earth that needs the allies? Is it those plants and animals that can't speak for themselves? Is it these vulnerable communities? Maybe you could just talk a little bit about, why you chose to name it that.
Yeah, that's great. Um, Jess, How, and I kind of found our way to the Ally program. Number one, because we wanted to think of this idea of support, of entrusted care, of being aware of issues, but also being like an active um, participant and advocate for certain issues. So I think it's all of the above, all of the groups that you mentioned before, um, living things that can't speak for themselves, vulnerable communities. And we chose ally because it's a very positive, encompassing term, and it, in my opinion, has two parts, and that's awareness and education, knowledge of what's actually going on, and also the ability and willingness to do something about it. And so we chose Allied because it's not just the trainings and it's not just like participating in a climate march. It's the unifying force of both of those, of, to put it in kind of a funny way, knowing what you're talking about and actually talking about it, and doing something about it. So that's how we landed on the term ally, and also because we really wanted to draw people to the other ally program. We hope that every single Earth ally on campus is also a Marist ally, and we hope that every Marist ally is also an Earth ally. Um, I'm very big on how things are all interrelated, and so I think that being an ally to both has a lot of intersections about how you think about the world and the way you view not only Marist policy, but also kind of the way you view your own politics is related to these two ideas of being supportive of people and supportive of things that um, do no harm and make the world a better place.
I mean, I think this is a great question about whether or not, when you say isolated movement, in many ways, I think you're referring to, okay, are we just talking about policing and police brutality, right? Or is
Right.
it,
Right.
does it involve these larger systemic issues? And it's something that I've thought a lot about in my own environmental advocacy recently is how do you have that tough conversation with someone who is on the front lines of those concerns about getting home safely every night or their children getting home safely and try to convince them to be thinking about something like climate change or clean water,
Right.
which might seem disconnected from their daily reality or long-term problems, less urgent, shall we say, even though I think you and I both agree that they are very urgent. But
Mhm.
how do you have a respectful conversation that acknowledges those concerns without making people feel like you're diluting them?
That's a great question. That's a hard one too. I think that the way to do that is also realizing that um, the impacts of environmental injustice are perhaps some of the most starkly uh, inequitable um, effects. Like the effects are just so different for people who are with privilege in terms of class, race, so on. Like they're not going to feel the impacts of climate change, of environmental issues, of environmental pollution more than the people who frequently talk about these issues. And so the third question I have on here is, we kind of already addressed these two, but is environmentalism racist and exclusionary? And to some degree it is. Like environmental sciences, whether you're talking about a field biologist or even an environmental justice advocate, tend to be white. And so there's this huge bias about talking about where impacts lie and who receives the brunt um, of the impact. So when we're talking about climate change, the people who are feeling climate change right now uh, tend to be from the global south or are from developing countries and are experiencing a level of poverty that is extreme. And so they face the brunt of climate change. And we don't even really have to, in our kind of privileged American bubble, even think about the impacts of that, that desperation that impacts. And so there's that level of it, of realizing that to be like a true ally, you have to be aware that despite, you're probably going to be fine, but there's perhaps millions, even billions of people who are at risk for the way you're living currently. And then we can apply that level also to the United States with these actions of I may never, and I'll never know, um, the true impacts of institutional racism and or police brutality. Um, but I do understand that it has a really severe impact. And when we're talking about environmental justice in the United States, how Black Americans bear the brunt of um, pollution, of poor environmental health effects, asthma rates, and so when you come down to what's killing people, especially vulnerable people, it comes down to a lot of these environmental hazards and these environmental health effects, these hazards that people are facing in their everyday environment. So looking at it on a global scale, the impacts of climate change affect people in poverty more, and right here in the United States, the impacts of um, environmental pollution impact vulnerable people in the United States. And so that's not only answering the first question about allyship, but also this idea of how do you communicate the urgency? Communicating the urgency is saying, like, there are tons and tons of vulnerable people. Now, this is impacting everyone, but it's going to impact some people more, and making sure that we're aware of that.
And I think it's interesting that, you said is environmentalism racist? I mean, I might argue that it's the environmental movement that has been exclusionary thus far.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the makeup of the community, but also the issues that have been focused on, for a long time, a real narrow focus on wilderness, for example, which is very
Exactly.
far removed from the experience of urban dwellers. And so, I wonder if what what needs to happen for that exclusion to shift is for the makeup of the community to change. And then where do we focus? Do we focus on getting leadership in, some of the more well-known, well-resourced environmental groups? Do we need to get more people of color in those leadership positions, or should it start at the bottom where you have, the grassroots looks a little different in terms of who the members are and the protesters? I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
Um, can you repeat that one more time, just the last part?
Yeah, no, I'm just saying if we want the makeup of the environmental community to change, and I mean, obviously the answer is ideally like both, right? But
Right.
should the focus be more on getting people of color into positions of leadership in, say, the largest environmental organizations, which has been, exclusively white males of a certain education level and socioeconomic background? Or is it more important to focus on the grassroots? Because, something that I'm really interested in is the fact that the membership of these groups is also largely white, right? The same
Right.
biases as leadership. But when you look at public opinion, public concern about environmental issues, people of color report higher levels of concern and higher levels of interest in it. But somehow that's not translating into them being welcomed into that community.
Yeah.
So, we might think about where the first effort should go.
Yeah, I think the personally, I think that representation always matters, and that having people of color in top leadership positions of these organizations is particularly important. But also the giving power to like real power to grassroots organizers, I think is also tremendously important. Um, an idea that I've heard and I strongly agree with is the idea of um, federal lands in the United States are these huge swaths of public land, and yet they have almost no input from American Indian folk, from indigenous peoples, and so they're completely cut out of a decision that really ought to be, they ought to be a part of it. And so it is a real strong um, barrier and idea of like where do you start, from the bottom or the top? And I think the idea is you probably have to start from both and kind of meet your way to the middle. Um, I think a particular um, way of incorporating more people of color into the larger environmental movement that has been so dominated by white voices, is to have a renewed focus on environmental justice and environmental health, instead of this idea, like you mentioned before, of like the great American wilderness. And all of that is really great, and public land is a very important issue to me. But I think that the idea that people's environments are killing them and we can do something about it, and it's patently unfair, and it's a very, very clear example of institutional racism, and putting more focus, more attention, more hours on those topics, environmental health, environmental justice, is a way of kind of figuring out how the top and the bottom can meet in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just looking at the chat here, and Jonathan
Yeah,
is pointing out very correctly that, we have an example of that top level leadership with Aaron Mayer from the Sierra Club,
Sierra
who's
Club.
been talking about these issues, for a long time. Unfortunately, like everybody knows him because he is so rare in that
Right,
position,
right.
right? Yeah.
And I think that's very important also, is um, with these environmental issues, is highlighting and focusing on Black scientists and scientists of color that have been so frequently pushed to the fringe of environmental sciences, of environmental policy making, and really making sure that the key component of allyship, of like letting people speak, and giving up your platform, and that is, I think, tremendously important, and highlighting like Black scientists, and showing you know people all over the United States that I can be a wildlife biologist too. I can be an environmental sciences teacher. I can go into environmental policy. Like, this issue that already affects my community so much, like I can be a huge change maker in that regard.
And I kind of like want to shift gears for a second here because, like, unfortunately, this is not the only crisis that we're undergoing right now, right? The
Absolutely.
reason that we're all sitting in our individual spaces doing this is partly because, of the pandemic that's happening. So, I mean, similar concerns about how to convince people to care about environmental issues while there's a global health pandemic happening, but also, some of the news that's come out about environmental issues during this time is like, look what happens when people stay home, when people
Right.
stop commuting, when they stop driving, when they stop consuming. Look what happens to the environment. So I don't know, can we draw any lessons from that, or what are some of your? I've seen like varied reactions to, air pollution levels dropping and things like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Um, I think from a local level, something that I've noticed is a lot more people are outside because it's the only thing they can do. And this is a very local issue of public park access and green space access. I think that the more we connect people to parks, in some degree, really impacts environmental health, people's well-being, people's sanity during the pandemic. And I think the coronavirus has shown, like, humans have a very, very, very strong impact. And even, this minimal change, people are still going to grocery stores, people are still going out, essential workers are still going out. But we see these kind of sometimes marginal, sometimes, extreme dips. I think that we can learn from. I don't want to like say that it was worth the cost, because it's 100% not worth the cost of everything that's been lost to coronavirus, but like keeping these components of really valuing our park system, of maybe walking outside more, of using cars less, of kind of realizing that we can do things without such a huge energy burden and energy usage, like keeping some of those lessons that we learned and maybe writing them down the line into some type of larger policy, would be a thing we can draw from the current pandemic. And also, Earth Ally is all online, so you can take this course when you're at home, and really um, you know gain that understanding of environmental issues, and then kind of practice those in your everyday life.
Well, you were ahead of your time, Matt. We didn't know it was coming, but it worked out. It's in the days when like the internet was first taking off, we started talking about how it was going to like transform the idea of community. And, um, it's obviously that has already happened in many ways with like social media, but now it's like the only way to connect, right? So
Yeah,
it's really been kind of a grand experiment and seeing whether or not that community really worked and whether or not it's as satisfying, all those interesting things.
absolutely.
So, all right, I want to like take us back a little bit, and think about this. We've been talking about it on a grand scale, but let's bring it to like the Marist scale and think about, you were a student, right? You have that kind of perspective as a faculty member. I have a different perspective, but what do you think the climate is at Marist around environmental issues in general? Like, what do you see as some of the strengths of the community here and areas? I mean, you obviously thought you could fill a void and serve a purpose with this program. So, what are some of the areas that need some growth still?
Yeah, I that's a great question. And I think when Jess and I were originally thinking about this program, we were the president and vice president of the environmental club on campus, and we were particularly interested in combating apathy. And Jess and I worked pretty hard on a earlier petition when we were freshmen about divestment, and that was the year, I believe, of the faculty white paper. I
Mhm.
was probably like my very early on in my freshman year, and we were really um, kind of very like pushed back by how little people either cared or were trying to transform the one in student-led environmental club on campus into a like let's go outside club, like a hiking club almost. And so that's one of the things that we really wanted to combat in some way is this kind of just like general apathy or not really like being at all concerned with environmental awareness or politics. And also on a larger scale is we were both had different second majors. So I was political science for a little bit, and she was economics. And so we were learning about these other fields, and we really wanted to bring them all together with something we were passionate about with environmental science. And we wanted to focus on these connections and bringing people to care and love and think about the environment through an idea of getting people involved and just like getting our kind of foot in the door, um, and also realizing that Introduction to Environmental Sciences, the intro course, is the most taken science course to fill the liberal arts requirement um, out of any science course across the college. And so we were wondering like where is this gap of kind of getting people really passionate about environmental issues. And also, another problem with environmental issues is sometimes they're very unsexy issues to talk about. Like um, they're not always in the forefront, particularly with issues like climate change. It's really hard to understand sometimes. And I majored in it for 4 years, and I would not consider myself even close to being, a at an introductory level, middle level of thinking or understanding about climate change. And so I think people get very turned off from environmental issues. And so that was kind of a different pieces that we were looking at, the apathy, people being turned off. And Justin and I were particularly bothered by the vast amount of people who we talked to who said, oh, I don't do politics. I don't really care about it. Um, and we were like, that's like such a silly take. Like, of course you have political opinions. Like, do you think that, like everything has to do with politics? And we were seeing in her senior year, my junior year, the big get out to vote for the midterms in 2018 idea, and we were like, what can we do to like make people realize that it's all connected, that it's all connected in some way, like the way you vote, the way you think, the things that you do, like it has to do with the environment. It's not just about wilderness or like environmental sciences. Like it's about this huge field that we're learning so much about and so much more about every day that really touches all of our lives. And getting the Marist community to kind of wake up and realize that. And to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of it came from a place of disappointment and anger. I know we were really disappointed with that the outcome of that faculty white paper and the idea of divestment. I know that we joked about the Yale divestment movement was really successful, and we were like, we did that like 2.5 years ago, and they did it in 2019. Like we're talking about the same environmental solutions like over and over and over again, and like how can we address that in some small way? And we both settled on this idea of the the Earth Ally program.
Well, that's great. I mean, I think you hit on two really important things there. One is people being afraid that they don't know enough to speak up
Yes,
about it.
exactly.
And the second thing is something else that I've observed is the idea of shying away from getting political, right?
Right.
Which has a negative connotation to it. And I'm remembering, I don't know if you remember this experience that you and I had together with a presentation that I gave in the dorms, right? And we had
Yes.
an attendee. It was for me, it was one of the most interesting experiences of my time at Marist because I don't even remember what exactly we were talking about. If it had something to do with climate change though. And a
Yeah.
student that attended was a climate skeptic, and not like a mild one, right? Like pretty
No.
intense. And so that was a fascinating experience to hear her views and then to watch how the rest of the students in the room tried to engage with her. And you all had very different strategies for doing so. And
Yeah.
so it made me think of that when you describe sort of part of the purpose of the Ally Project being to argue better.
Yeah.
And I think that, okay, that's an extreme case, and you probably aren't as likely to encounter as many people like that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how this program can help people when they either to build their confidence for, everyday conversations or when they encounter somebody like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we first started the program, we overheard this group of people talking, and a lot of these kind of programs that I've like the Yale divestment movement, I know started with like people overhearing a conversation or something like that. But we heard a conversation about these people who were talking about like climate change and environmental issues, and Jess and I were both sitting there and we were thinking like, wow, like that's a lot of misinformation out there, like a lot of like things that like aren't that. And then experiences of arguing with people over climate change, and you fall into these like kind of like logic pitfalls, these gaps of where you get into these circular arguments, and then it's just so unproductive. And so what we were hoping for is not only for ourselves, like we were thinking maybe if we compile all these things just for us to look at, like we can think about these things more and maybe like convince, not even convince, but just like talk in a way that like gets people to understand that what we're talking about isn't like this something crazy. And the Earth Ally program really factors in like you can either spend 20 minutes with each lesson or you can spend hours with each lesson, like looking deep into the resources. And it's a place to go to when you get into those pitfalls. Like I think a lot of people like get into like these arguments with like friends or family, and you're just so frustrated, and you keep being like, but it is real, like please. Like having the Earth Ally program to like turn back to and be like, I knew I wasn't like talking out of my, like I was actually like I knew what I was talking about. Like I can stay updated on the latest research. I can stay like engaged. I can argue better and fight for these things that make a lot of sense, that are really positive policy changes that will make people's lives better. And like this is just like a really small start to that. Like being able to log on, go through these trainings, and then circle back to resources. The resources are open, so if you find a great resources, the Earth Ally team will post that. Like it's this constant flow of what I think is the best activism, and that's activism that is like really informed, and people who just like love to learn about what's going on first and then kind of take a really hard um or whatever, not hard, but just a stance on what's going on. Yeah.
So that also kind of leads me to another comment that was in the chat box, which is about how members of the community, including alumni, can contribute to the program.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that? How can we facilitate that? And where
Absolutely.
do you see this going in the future?
Great. So one of the presentations is actually was done at the time by an alumni. Anna Hurd gave our solid waste and pollution. Um, and I think that first, I would love for someone who is a current undergrad to take up the project as their honors thesis. I think that the Marist honors thesis is one of the best parts of being at Marist, and you're given so much latitude on what you have to do. It's by no means a conventional um, thesis. So hopefully finding someone to take that on, and then for alumni, if they want to give their own presentation on something that they're very interested in, and really growing this bank of trainings. Like we just started 9 units to get people thinking. I'd love to see units on any different type of environmental issue. If you want to do one on public land engagement, on a whole environmental Earth Ally program on the Dakota Access Pipeline, any thing that you're particularly passionate about as an alumni, like make it into a little PowerPoint, voice it over, throw it up on the Earth Ally program site, and then other people can kind of get involved and think about it and receive credit. And I think the forum section is a great place too. A free flow of ideas, of feelings. I think that a lot of times with environmental policy, we don't talk about like our feelings on it enough. Like, um, you know, it's okay. Like I think it and of course I'm becoming a social worker, a therapist, so like being like I'm really scared about like this idea of climate change. Like it sometimes I feel like shut down by it, like it's too big, it's too complicated, like I don't like it. Like thinking and writing out things about that and then having other people answer. I think alumni serve a really important part because they're out in the field, like environmental scientists out there, and also just like kind of talking with other people. Like I sometimes feel lost, like I sometimes feel unable to communicate, I sometimes feel like I'm not doing enough. Like all of those things can be thrown into the forum section and people can have different ideas being tossed around and just thinking about different ways of getting involved in this bigger idea of advocacy and combating environmental apathy. Yeah.
Great. So, like, let's talk a little bit about your process here of putting this all together. So, I know you were very deliberate in wanting to involve these different constituencies on campus. So, that's why you have presenters from, all, students, faculty, staff. And you also had to, of course, contend with technological issues with making
Yeah.
this, a system on iLearn. So, what was like the most rewarding part? What's been the most challenging part?
Um, I think the part that the right off the hardest part is getting people to do it. Very, very low enrollment in the program, um, very low like certification rate, if you will. Um, Hopefully it's going to be this Earth Ally program is going to be used in environmental classes. I know that Dr. Zion used some of the lessons for his introduction to environmental issues in some of his other classes, which is really great. But I think that's probably the part that's been the hardest is people um, don't really want to participate in this, and I totally understand that. And that's something that I definitely could have put more forethought into about, having people participate in the program. It is a time commitment, and I think if I could do it all over again, I would focus on in-person trainings a lot more, and focusing on how specific groups of people can use it. I know Steve was interested in using it as he used to give a presentation to all new faculty and staff about personal sustainability. And instead now he can hopefully just use that personal sustainability slideshow that's already been made and just kind of be like, you have to go through this. So that's definitely been the hardest part. The most rewarding part, I think, has been working with the people that gave up all their time to do the presentations and hearing what they have to say. Dr. Klaus, Dr. Zion is a hydrologist and a climate scientist, and he did the presentations on climate change and water pollution and water sciences. And that's so cool to have that kind of in-house expertise and someone who's really passionate about it, as well as my dear friend Ellie did the food and agricultural systems presentation. And so she not only did her own research, um, but leaned on me for writing kind of the script and doing the PowerPoint outline, and then we came together and really came out with like a really good product that we were particularly proud of, and so that was really rewarding. And I also loved being able to think about the interconnectedness of all of these issues with food, with our food and agricultural system PowerPoint, we spent a lot of time on food insecurity in the United States. And that's an intersection issue with environmental justice. We talked a lot about school lunches, about hungry kids, um, and this idea of that's all about environmental science, like soil sciences, agricultural sciences. That's totally under the umbrella of what we're talking about here with environmental policy and environmental change. And so that I think is the most personally enriching part is I got to, for basically like 3 credits, tons of hours of time, think about and really formulate my own values as like a growth experience with these issues. And it's part of the reason why I love social work so much is I never am allowed to think about something in a box. Like I can't just think about, food and agricultural systems. Like it has so much to do with poverty, class, race, sociology, psychology, like educational policy. Like we can't view things in boxes anymore. And I think that's particularly evident with movements that we're seeing today is like we have to think about that like environmentalism in a box does nothing. And it just like, it is so unuseful to people. And so thinking about it in this allyship capacity is so useful. And being like, I can pick out these issues and think about the way these kind of complex systems work together um, is very rewarding.
Well, and ultimately, one of the goals is not just to build the number of Earth allies, but to build them from different parts of campus,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So to get people, you mentioned how you see all these connections. I don't know that people naturally see that, right? So if you can show that to them, how every single major on this campus has some kind of connection to issues of the environment and sustainability. And so understanding that it is their issue, no matter what constituency they come from, I think would be a huge win for the program.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just saw this comment that popped up about kind of what we were talking about between facts and opinions and partisan political positions. Um, and that's something that we really wanted to focus on for in the Marist Earth Ally program is every single piece of information that we put on the platform is checked for being a reliable source. Every person that every PowerPoint presentation and training is all fact based and science based. And so when we're presenting on, say, food and agricultural systems, like we list out like this many American, like these many, like this amount of Americans is obese, like source CDC, like so on and so forth, all science based. And then what we wanted is in the forum section is for people to be like, I'm angry, like this makes me upset, like this shouldn't be a thing, like we shouldn't have this like total corn based diet. We shouldn't have no indigenous voices in the National Park Service. Like we shouldn't have like total reliance on fossil fuels. Like I'm angry, I'm upset about this. Like that's how I feel. And so that's the separation between, I think, like the science, like the PowerPoints are hard and fast, like this is the history of the environmental justice movement. This is the environmental justice movement today. But then following up in the forums with um, like I'm upset it's taken this long. Like I'm encouraged by like youth voices. So just to kind of address a little bit that comment that was made. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I teach classes in political science, so I deal with a lot of issues that are partisan, or at least have different opinions. And then I also teach this that has the
Yeah.
scientific component. And I don't find it hard at all, actually, to say, like, here's the accepted scientific consensus. That's not debatable. What is what we do about it.
Right.
Right? How much we
Absolutely. Absolutely.
prioritize, what
Yeah.
choices we want to make around that. But, I agree that there isn't a need to litigate science itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, what you're talking about earlier is our experience with that climate change denier is there was a lot of feelings and a lot of like feelings over fact. And that's something that we wanted to address with, like let's argue better is, you if you have the science mind frame, then you can formulate from that values and you can think about what policies you support and you can also think about your feelings on the issue and kind of like the way those four components of things work together is really important. And I think, Marist Political Science Department does a really good job, but, we don't always make the connection between policy, our values, and, the science behind it. And I think that by pushing the resources out there, the valid scientific the resources, um, news media that is um, consulting experts and then writing narratives about it, and then formulating these other things down the line about like really thinking like, do I support this policy? Like, what are my thoughts? What are my feelings? Like, can I put this into practice? All of those things revolving together, hopefully start from like this little spark of the Earth Ally program, and then you can really get to thinking about what's going on. And I think that's a huge goal of a liberal arts education is just figuring out to bring this really broadly to the Marist community like is figuring out about your values. Like I don't remember from Dr. Boscarino's class like every like environmental law that we learned about or every kind of public policy type, but like I do remember that it like learning about the science and the policy helped me shape my values and like what I believe in and what I vote for and what I'm gonna like teach my kids. And so like that is a huge component of being in college. And this honors thesis has allowed me to really, do that and think about that, how values and what we learn intersect.
So, I mean, you were required to do a project, right, as part of the honors
Yeah.
program. You chose to do this one. How did it cap off your experience as an honors program student?
I think first it gave me, and I have to absolutely credit you with this, is like the independence of kind of, you know, like a thesis project is the student taking charge of their own little research interest, and I was able to, I didn't have to do a conventional thesis like other universities where, you staple your 50-page paper on, the inequities of this and that and hand it in. Like this is my honors thesis was an online iLearn project that was specifically tailored for the Marist community, and I got to combine all of these things that I'm really passionate about. And again, one of the reasons why I love social work is I get to bring in all of these different like crazy things into one, messy but kind of complete picture. And so that's what I loved about, Marist afforded me that opportunity through the honors thesis to not be confined to a paper on a topic, but rather a project about something that you care about. And you see this through almost all of the other thesis projects is you the honors program gives the students the ability to kind of take it how they see it, like whatever project they want to do, like is the administration of the honors program works with them. And so it was the perfect rounding off of my kind of Marist experience, my Marist 4 years, because it allowed me to take in all like pieces from all of the classes that I learned and actually interact with all of the people that I got to share it with. So I took a lot of classes with Dr. Feldman, and I was able to, he did one of the units, Dr. Klaus, one of my favorite classes, you and your class, like bringing in what you learned, and then you actually do like participating in, having a voice in part of my honors thesis, um, was just incredible and really rounded it out for me. And, it was all because of Marist that I was able to, you know, take that unique thesis opportunity.
Well, it was a pleasure to work with you. And, we wish you luck in your next venture in grad school and then going off to do all this great work as a social worker. So I just want to, thank all the attendees, thank Matt. And I also want to put it out there that if anybody that's listening right now wants to get involved, get in touch with me. Get in touch with Matt too, but of course he's going to be off doing his grad school thing. So while I'm sure he'll stay connected, I can be kind of like the point person at Marist for right now for what happens with the Earth Ally program. So if anybody has any last questions, maybe stick them in the chat right now.
Yeah.
We'll hang out for a minute. Otherwise, we really want to thank you for listening. It's been fun.
Yes. Thank you everyone so much.